There was a beat between two people that no one else could hear. It began as a soft tremor, the kind that slips under doors and through carefully built walls, a vibration carried by glances that lasted a second too long. It wasn't the thunder of sudden passion or the blaze of reckless daring. It was a quiet, insistent pulse, steady, undeniable, and impossible to name without breaking something sacred. The first time the rhythm made itself known, it lived in a simple exchange. Coffee cups passed across a kitchen island, fingers almost brushing, a laugh that found the right frequency and lingered in the chest. There was no reason for it, no invitation, nothing that could be written down or confessed aloud. Yet the conversation stretched like warm taffy, sweet and sticky, refusing to let go. A remark became a story became a shared memory that didn't technically belong to both, and suddenly an ordinary morning had edges soft enough to step across. The world didn't turn dramatic to accommodate it. No romantic soundtrack, no cinematic lighting, just everyday moments that kept returning with a strange shimmer. A crowded backyard, smoke curling from the grill, voices colliding and dissolving. A joke tossed across the table and caught in midair, igniting a smile that felt too personal. The slight tilt of a head when listening, the patience of eyes that seemed to notice what others missed, the way worry showed up in the shoulders, the way relief loosened every breath. It felt like being recognized in a language that had never been learned and somehow always known. Of course, the mind tried to tidy it away. This is nothing. This is kindness. This is friendship. These are friendly eyes, friendly words, a friendly voice. But the rhythm kept timing each encounter, tapping against the ribs, reminding that truth often wears ordinary clothes. There was a particular evening. Rain hushed the street, lamps turned windows into small golden seas, and conversation walked itself into an unexpected honesty. Work, families, the future that everyone assumed was set in stone. Questions rose like steam. So did answers that weren't answers at all, just careful shifts around the thing that had no name. The quiet between sentences swelled until it felt like a room of its own. Distance was the rule, respect was the line drawn in permanent ink, and yet the pulse didn't care for rules. It slipped into the space between words. It waited inside shared silence and glowed when laughter came at the same time. It pressed gently on the sternum when he reached for a dish and paused to let another hand pass, as if choreography had been rehearsed in secret. It drew attention to details that shouldn't matter. The small scar just above his knuckle, the way he cleared his throat when troubled, the reverent way he spoke about people he loved. Nothing was dramatic, and yet everything felt important. There were moments that called for escape, a step back, a changed subject, a glass set down too quickly. Once, a phone vibrated on the counter, and the sound broke the spell with such mercy it almost felt like grace. Another time, in a room full of people, a story landed too squarely on an old bruise, and the look that followed carried tenderness too heavy to hold. The gaze was broken on purpose, as if the eyes themselves understood the cost of staying. Still, the rhythm found ways to return, a shared playlist playing softly in the background at a gathering, pulling a mutual favorite from the past, lyrics that should have meant nothing suddenly unveiled private meanings. A chorus bloomed and everything else went quiet inside, the way the world stills at the center of a storm. Someone asked for a refill, someone else laughed, chairs scraped tile, and beneath it all the beat kept time. The pull wasn't a hunger that burned everything in its path. It was gentler and more dangerous, a recognition that carried both solace and risk. The mind kept running inventory, loyalty, history, promises made in daylight. The heart, traitorous as always, insisted that some things arrive without asking and refuse to leave without being felt. The body listened to both, standing perfectly still in rooms where escape routes had already been mapped. There were days when absence pressed more insistently than presence. a message left unanswered by design, a plan declined with a polite reason. The space created felt like safety and sounded like an echo. The pulse never stopped. It simply moved farther away, like a drumline heard from the next street over, faint yet certain, reminding that closeness wasn't the cause, connection was. The truth hadn't been born of proximity. It had revealed itself because two lives had been tuned to the same frequency all along. Words hovered on thresholds and didn't cross. That was the strange grace of it. The language formed easily in the mind. This is dangerous, and yet it feels like destiny wearing a disguise. But words remain honest when they are kept inside, a kind of silent vow to cause no harm. The eyes did most of the speaking, small nods when victories were shared, softened edges when disappointments appeared, little pieces of courage offered without ceremony. Even gestures learned restraint, choosing distance when closeness became a risk. A hand would rise, stop midair, and turn into a wave. A step would begin and then be replaced by a smile. Nothing happened, and somehow everything did. The pulse grew stronger on a night winter stepped close to the windows, and frost drew lace along the edges of glass. Exhaustion had thinned every guard. The conversation was about nothing. News headlines, a broken lamp, a meal that didn't turn out. The kind of small talk that protects what matters most. Then there was a pause, unplanned. Breathing felt loud. The air itself seemed to ask for honesty. A heartbeat answered by quickening. Not a word passed between two people who had been speaking all evening. The silence carried the shape of a confession and the mercy of a refusal. A nod replaced a sentence. The look said, "Yes, it's here." The look also said, "No, it can't be." In the days that followed, the world insisted on continuing as usual. Work emails, grocery lists, overdue errands. Yet every ordinary task carried a private afterglow, like fingers warmed by a candle long after the flame has been pinched out. The rhythm stayed steady, softer perhaps, but steady. It turned into a private metronome for choosing goodness over impulse, for holding something beautiful with careful hands even if those hands could never truly hold it. What made it feel like destiny wasn't the danger, it was the clarity. Not the kind that demands action, but the kind that rearranges a life without moving a single piece of furniture. A person could wake up in the same bed, brew the same coffee, answer the same messages, and still know that something wordless had taken up residence in the chest. That knowledge asked for gentleness with everything and everyone. It turned sudden judgments into quiet compassion. It made room for nuance, for the truth that love can be real and still not be right, that a heart can find its reflection and still choose not to break the mirror. Sometimes the pulse felt like a blessing, the right story at the right time, told by the right voice, a way of feeling seen without applause, forgiven without confession. Other times it felt like a penance, an ache that woke in the middle of the night, demanding to be acknowledged. The rhythm didn't ask for understanding. It simply asked not to be lied about, at least not in the quiet where the soul keeps accounts. It was both temptation and teacher, a paradox with perfect posture. There were people who would never understand. To them, love is a clean line with tidy edges, and goodness is a series of simple choices. Perhaps they are lucky. Perhaps they have never stood in a room where the light made every dust mote look like a star and known, with absolute certainty, that one wrong step could bring the sky down. Perhaps they have never felt a kindness so precise it seemed engineered just for the shape of their thoughts. Perhaps they have never stood next to someone and recognized the outline of a shared future that could never be lived, and yet the pulse never demanded an ending worthy of its beginning. It asked for honesty. It asked for honor. It asked to be felt fully and carried carefully, even if that meant carrying it alone. So the rhythm became a prayer whispered under the noise of daily life. Let this remain pure in memory. Let it make everything softer, not harder. Let it remind that the heart is capable of extraordinary music, even when the dance must never be danced. The spark that shouldn't exist taught the language of restraint and the courage of tenderness. It proved that two souls can find each other across a room crowded with obligations and still choose to leave the room unchanged. It left no evidence anyone could hold up to the light, but inside, where truth keeps its ledger, the ink glows. Something holy passed through, and it was loved enough to be left untouched, and the pulse goes on. Every moment carried a weight that couldn't be seen, but was felt in every breath. The kind of weight that doesn't crush, just presses, quietly, steadily, reminding that something beautiful can also be dangerous. There was no plan, no slow build toward betrayal, just a small fracture in the boundaries of the heart that widened each time kindness crossed the line into something deeper. It began with simple conversations, harmless enough to anyone watching. Words about work, about life, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. There was comfort in being understood so effortlessly, in the way silence didn't feel like distance but connection. Every time laughter filled the air, the sound felt like a secret that didn't belong to the world. The eyes would meet and linger, and in that lingering, a quiet truth grew. Something real, something impossible. The guilt came first, sharp and immediate, like cold air after a door slams. It sat in the chest like a stone. Every moment of tenderness carried a shadow of wrongness that refused to be ignored. The mind tried to reason with the heart, to pull it back from the edge, to remind it of vows, promises, lives already woven together. But reason is small when emotions turn into gravity, and gravity doesn't ask permission before pulling. There were nights when sleep wouldn't come, when thoughts replayed the smallest gestures until they became entire worlds. The way his eyes softened when he listened, the quiet strength in his voice when he said her name, not the name, but the way it was said, as if the syllables themselves deserved gentleness. It wasn't lust that haunted those hours. It was recognition, the unmistakable feeling of being seen without disguise, without effort, without defense. Every stolen glance became a question without an answer. Every casual touch, a confession neither dared to speak. The heart raced not because of fear, but because of truth, the kind that cannot exist without cost, and still there was restraint. Every impulse to reach out was swallowed. Every word that could break the world was left unspoken. There was no plan to betray, no intent to destroy, only the unbearable ache of wanting something that couldn't be had. Sometimes it felt like standing between two mirrors, trapped in an endless reflection of loyalty and desire. On one side, duty whispered of promises made, of lives built on trust and shared years. On the other, desire spoke softly of what could be, of the rare miracle of two souls vibrating at the same frequency. The body stood still between them, pulled in both directions, breaking a little more each day. There were moments when distance became the only form of love possible, skipped invitations, changed routines, polite excuses meant to protect what was already cracking. And yet, even in distance, the connection didn't fade, it deepened. Every absence made the longing louder, more certain, more alive. It was as if the universe itself conspired to remind what had been felt, refusing to let it dissolve into forgetting. One evening, the line nearly disappeared. A conversation turned too honest, too vulnerable. The air thickened with everything that had been left unsaid. There was no movement, no reckless act, just a silence heavy enough to change everything. Eyes met, and in that stillness lived every possibility, every fear, every reason to stay and to run. The world held its breath, waiting for a choice that neither could make. After that night, guilt and desire became inseparable. Every thought of him came with the echo of what could never be undone. There was a kind of holiness in the restraint, a strange purity in the suffering, to want and not take, to love and still protect the very thing that love could destroy. That became the quiet act of devotion. It wasn't weakness, it was strength measured in silence. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life returned, at least on the surface. But beneath it all, the current still moved. Sometimes it surfaced in the smallest ways. A look across a crowded room, a hand brushing past another's without reason. Each touch left fire beneath the skin, the kind that warms and wounds at once. No one else noticed. No one else needed to. Some stories exist only between the spaces of what is seen. The guilt never left, but it changed shape. It became less about wrongness and more about truth. It was the price of feeling something real in a world that often settles for comfort. There was no villain, no victim, only two people caught in the gravity of recognition. What they shared wasn't an affair of the body, but of the soul, and sometimes that's the hardest kind to survive. Time kept moving, as it always does. Seasons shifted, faces aged, and responsibilities called louder than desire. Life demanded its due, and they answered quietly, separately, but the memory remained, not as a wound, but as a pulse that sometimes beat beneath the surface of ordinary days. In moments of quiet reflection, when the world seemed too still, that pulse returned, a reminder of the choice that had been made, the love that had been felt, and the cost of keeping both sacred. There was no resolution, no perfect ending tied with grace. Only acceptance that love can live in forbidden places and still be pure, that loyalty and desire can coexist in the same heart, tearing and teaching it all at once, that sometimes the bravest thing love can do is stay silent. And in that silence, the heart learned that loyalty isn't the absence of desire, it's the strength to hold it, to honor what is real without destroying what is right. Because sometimes the deepest kind of love isn't the one that's fulfilled. It's the one that's forever restrained and yet never forgotten. That night began like any other, with the world pretending it wasn't about to change. The air outside was heavy, the kind that feels alive, waiting for something to happen. Inside, the lights were dim, soft enough to blur the edges of right and wrong. There was laughter, the kind that fills a room but doesn't reach the heart. Beneath it, silence waited patient, knowing it wasn't supposed to be anything more than a conversation. Two people talking the way they always did, careful, restrained, pretending that every word didn't already mean something more. But that night had a different rhythm. There was no noise from the street, no interruptions from the world. It felt like time had folded itself around the moment, leaving only them and the weight of everything unsaid. The conversation drifted from light to heavy without either noticing when it changed. Old memories resurfaced, mistakes, regrets, the kind of truths that usually stay buried under polite smiles. Words came slower, voices lower. There was no distance left to hide behind. Every confession, no matter how small, felt like a step closer to something that had been waiting quietly for far too long. When laughter returned, it wasn't from humor, but from relief, the kind that escapes when the truth is finally too big to ignore. A hand reached out to pour another drink, and in that small motion, fingers brushed. It should have meant nothing. It didn't. That single touch cracked open everything they'd been trying to hold together. The air changed first. Breathing felt different, deliberate, careful, shared. Eyes met, and suddenly the silence wasn't empty anymore. It pulsed with something alive, something dangerous. No words could fit into that moment, and maybe none were needed. A glance held longer than it should. A heartbeat skipped, and the distance between them dissolved like smoke. Every instinct screamed to stop, to remember all the reasons this couldn't happen, but reason had no voice left. There was only that feeling, that deep, aching certainty that this was not desire born of impulse, but recognition born of truth, the kind of truth that hides until the world is quiet enough to hear it. The first touch wasn't planned. It didn't belong to any version of reality they'd promised to protect. It was soft, hesitant, as if both were waiting for the other to turn away. When no one did, the silence between them broke open completely. A touch became a language, fluent and fragile. Every breath, every movement carried meaning that words could only ruin. It wasn't wild or rushed. It was slow, almost reverent, like trying to memorize something that would never happen again. Every heartbeat felt like a confession. Every sigh was both an apology and a surrender. There was guilt in it, yes, but there was also something sacred and understanding that what was unfolding wasn't sin or accident, but truth stripped bare of excuses. Outside, the wind shifted. Rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows, the world's quiet witness. Inside, time stopped keeping score. Every second stretched long enough to feel eternal. There was no thought of mourning, of consequences, of the inevitable return to reality. Only the moment existed, fragile, infinite, impossible. When it ended, there was no grand speech, no declaration of love or regret, just stillness, the kind of stillness that follows storms and carries both peace and ruin in equal measure. Breathing came slow. Eyes didn't meet right away, not out of shame, but out of reverence, as if looking too soon might shatter what had just been real. The weight of what happened didn't come crashing down immediately. It settled softly, like dust after something beautiful has broken. They both knew the line had been crossed, and that nothing could ever return to what it was. But they also knew that pretending it hadn't happened would be another kind of lie. Morning arrived quietly, indifferent to what had changed. The world looked the same, sunlight spilling through curtains, coffee brewing somewhere, footsteps in other rooms, but everything felt different. Every sound carried an echo of the night before. Every routine movement trembled under the knowledge of what had been shared. They didn't speak of it that day. Maybe they couldn't. Some truths live better in silence. There was no need to explain, no need to label what couldn't be defined. The memory of that night became a secret rhythm beneath ordinary days, a pulse that could never be silenced, no matter how deeply it was buried. In the days that followed, distance became necessary, not out of anger, but survival. Too much closeness would make honesty impossible. Too much honesty would make destruction inevitable. So they learned to look away, to keep conversations short, to pretend that the world hadn't been rewritten in a single night. But every time their eyes met, that pulse returned soft, steady, unrepentant. It was the kind of connection that doesn't fade, only hides. Some nights, when the air grows quiet again, it comes back, the memory, the breath, the feeling of belonging and breaking all at once. It doesn't ask to be relived, it just wants to be remembered. Because that night wasn't about passion or rebellion. It was about truth finally stepping into the light, if only for a moment. The heart learned something then, that real love isn't always right, and right love isn't always real. That sometimes the most genuine moments are the ones that cannot survive the morning, and yet they stay, alive and unforgotten, tucked beneath the surface of a life that must go on. That night changed everything, not because of what was done, but because of what was revealed. That love, no matter how impossible, can be pure even when it's forbidden. That the soul knows its reflection when it sees it, and even if it can't stay, it will never stop remembering. Silence became a place to live, not a punishment. It formed a soft-walled room inside the chest where all the loud things could finally rest. Longing, guilt, gratitude, the ache of what almost was. The world moved as it always does. Alarms and traffic, coffee rings on a desk, messages waiting with their little red dots of urgency. But underneath the noise, a quiet life bloomed where two names were never said together, and yet were always together. That's how a secret prayer works. It isn't repeated out loud. It beats its rhythm from within. There were days when the memory felt like breath itself. A song played in a store. No great anthem, just some forgotten chorus. And the body answered before the mind could interfere. Shoulders softened. A pulse stumbled. The past rose like heat from pavement after rain. Not the scenes that would break anything or anyone, but the small, holy ones. A shared glance that caught and held, an unfinished sentence that needed no ending, laughter that arrived at the same second and felt like a key turning in an old lock. Those moments stayed vivid, not to torture, but to remind that love had once stood here, unafraid of being real even when it could not be right. Silence asked for care. It required choices so gentle they almost looked like accidents. Invitations declined without explanation. Conversations kept brief enough to keep the trembling from the voice. Routes rearranged so chance wouldn't have too much power. Yet every guardrail came with mercy, because the heart knew what it was protecting wasn't a scandal. It was a tenderness that couldn't survive bright light. Let the daylight have everything it could catalog: rolls, rings, family photos lined like book spines. The night inside, the one held secretly in the ribs, would keep the truth safe without demanding it be lived. There were seasons when absence hurt more sharply, cutting clean lines through ordinary days. A holiday table with one chair too meaningful, a celebration that brought speeches, and one voice held steady through sentences that couldn't be listened to without feeling both proud and ruined. Hands stayed folded. Eyes found the nearest window. Outside, a tree bent in the wind, and that was the lifeline. Look, something else is moving too. The world keeps coaching survival that way. Wind in branches, buses coming and going, children dragging backpacks heavier than their bodies, an old couple arguing softly over grapes. Life insists. The secret prayer learns to nod, then breathe. No one else needed to know about the cathedral inside. There were no confessions, no tearful bargains, no dramatic renunciations. Just a quiet agreement with the soul. This happened. It mattered. It will be loved without being touched. Some afternoons, the memory came as warmth, like sunlight sneaking over a shoulder at a stoplight. Other times, it was a shadow that stretched long and thin, reminding that every decision has an echo. Both were accepted, both were carried. The carrying, more than anything, proved the love was real. There were letters that were never written and would never be sent. Whole paragraphs formed in the mind during walks where leaves made small applause underfoot. Thank you for seeing what no one else could see. You made the world kinder, even when it hurt. Forgive the flaws, the fear, the ways that goodness and desire wrestled until both fell asleep, exhausted. None of it reached paper, none of it needed to. The body learned to store what could not be said. It's astonishing how much a heart can hold when it turns its chambers into archives. Sometimes the silence brightened memory instead of dimming it. Every small kindness grew edges of gold in recollection. The way a joke arrived in time to save a difficult evening, the patience offered when grief made sentences collapse, the steady presence that required nothing in return. It felt like being carried across dangerous water without anyone seeing footprints on the shore. That kind of carrying does not demand repayment. It only asks not to be denied, so nothing was denied. The truth stayed intact, like a pressed wildflower hidden between pages. Fragile, yes, but also preserved. The hardest part was not the distance, but the mundanity that followed great trembling. Dishes still needed washing. Bills still arrived with their glassy eyes. News headlines shouted in capital letters. People wanted attention for their small storms, and attention was given. If anything, the secret made tenderness toward the ordinary multiply. It softened the voice offered to tired cashiers, made room for a neighbor's long story on a warm sidewalk, turned impatience into a kind of grief for time moving faster than anyone deserved. When love is carried in silence, the world's edges get padded. Hurt finds fewer places to bruise. On rare nights, sleep loosened its grip, and the mind walked back to the border where everything had once almost tipped over. not to replay or to revise, but to witness with respect. Look how brave that restraint was. Look how close the ruin came and how carefully it was turned away. There is a peace that belongs to those who choose not to take even when taking is possible. It arrives late, after the heat has cooled, carrying a blanket and water and a soft, knowing smile. Time made its usual bargains, faces changed, responsibilities deepened. New joys appeared that asked for whole attention. A child's first reading aloud, a parent's recovered health, a friend's unexpected rescue from despair. The secret prayer learned to braid itself into these joys, not as a thief of light, but as a guardian of it, because holding a complicated love privately teaches reverence for simple ones. The hands that once trembled now knew how to steady other hands. The mouth that once swallowed dangerous words now knew how to speak the right ones when someone else needed saving. There was a moment, planned like all the important ones, when the two paths crossed again in the open. Nothing dramatic, a crowded place, the hum of people with their own invisible cathedrals. Eyes found eyes for a flicker, and it happened. Gratitude passed like an invisible letter delivered by air. No touch. No words, only a recognition as clean as a bell alive, yes, still alive. And then the kindness of looking away. A miracle is not always loud. Sometimes it's simply the absence of harm exactly when harm would be easiest. After that, the memory took on a new temperature. It cooled into something that could be touched without burning. It held shape. It could be turned in the light and studied like glass, not to analyze its flaws, but to admire the fact of its survival. What a strange mercy to feel stronger not for having grasped, but for having released, to know that love, when kept in the right climate of silence and truth, doesn't rot, it ferments into gentleness, into patience, into courage that doesn't make speeches. Years layered themselves neatly. The prayer grew shorter, then smaller, then quieter still, until it became only a breath at the start of difficult days. Let goodness lead, even when longing lingers. That was enough, because the heart, contrary to every frantic legend, does not die from wanting. It dies from lying, and nothing about this needed a lie. It asked only for privacy and a steady hand. One evening, the kind of evening when the sky forgets its colors and settles on a deep, forgiving blue, the world stood very still for a while. Ordinary sounds echoed like gentle instruments in a hallway, cutlery, a dog's collar, a kettle surrendering its last hiss. In that hush, the memory walked through again, not as a ghost, but as a guest who knows the spare key's hiding place and uses it only to leave a gift on the table. The gift was simple, the reminder that love had taught something worth keeping, that not every beautiful thing must be owned, and not every real thing must be shown, that the heart can hold a vow and a longing without destroying either. The story never asked to be told, it asked only to be honored. And in the end, that is what happened, not with grand gestures, but with everyday mercies, choosing kindness over ego, truth over performance, presence over escape. The love that lived in silence stayed alive by doing what silence does best. It listened until the world softened. Some stories last because they are finished. This one lasts because it was spared. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because somewhere, someone still believes in a love that doesn't need forever only truth. Stay with true love story with deep love, where every heartbeat has a story worth telling.